The world's most volatile and strategic region may be on the verge of all-out war. And what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. Jonathan Schanzer knows that very well. He is a foremost expert on the region, and he's also Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C., and he joins us now in studio. John, great to have you with us. And hey, I look at the history. 1981, Israel takes out Iraq's nuclear reactor. 2007 takes out Syria's nuclear reactor. And now you're staring at an existential threat in the Iranian nuclear reactor. And John, it seems, and you've documented this on X and in your writing, great, in the past week, Hamas and Hezbollah severely weakened. It would seem Israel has kind of a clear path to take out this existential threat. Why wouldn't they do that right now?
So it's a great question, and it's all I've been trying to figure out over the last week or two. Obviously, Israel has a green light to strike inside Iran after that attack that the Iranians launched, the 181 ballistic missiles. So the Israelis are now trying to figure out what they can target, what the United States is going to be comfortable with, what they're comfortable with. Here's what I think we know so far. They're going to probably take out the intelligence services of the Iranian regime, because they tried to do it. The Iranians tried to do it to the Israelis. And you may have seen there was a massive crater about, a half a block away from the Mossad after that attack last week. And so the Israelis know what they were aiming for. They're going to have to show them how it's done. I think that's number one. Number two, you're probably going to see the Israelis strike the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC. Because
that's big.
That's big. These are the guys that are the command and control for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Houthis, for the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. Beyond that, I think we're probably going to see strikes against the air defenses of the Iranian regime, because they need to clear those before they take out anything else, right? You got to make sure that the aircraft can fly overhead without getting hit by those S-300 systems. From there, you have, you probably want to start to take a look at those ballistic missiles that the Iranians have stockpiled that they keep firing at Israel. You don't want any more of those flying into Israeli airspace. So if you can take them out, you probably will. Then it gets complicated, right? This is where I think the Israelis are starting to wring their hands a little bit. The clerics themselves, the supreme leader. I mean, these are the people that keep calling, the regime itself, right? These are the people that are calling for death to Israel, death to America every day. This is their goal. If the Israelis want to stop the problem, maybe they have to stop the people. But the Israelis have never done that before, right? They take out terrorist leaders. They take out Nasrallah. They take out, Hamas leaders. They've never really done this before. You take out the head of a sovereign state. So they're thinking about that long and hard. It would set a precedent that maybe they don't want to have, right? Because that might mean that Israeli leaders could get targeted in return. Then you got energy. And there, I think you're going to find some challenges with the White House, primarily. You start taking out energy resources in Iran.
Oil infrastructure.
Correct. You start doing that, and the price of oil shoots up with 3 weeks left to an election. The White House does not want that to happen. By the way, the Chinese might get a little grumpy about that too, given that Iran has been a major source of energy for them. They might get angry. Then comes the nuclear sites. And there, I think we're seeing the White House put an immense amount of pressure on the Israelis not to strike right now. But here's what I would say. If the Israelis take out a bunch of these other targets, soften the ground, clear the airspace, what's to stop them from coming back in another couple days, another couple weeks, and doing the work that we've seen them do in Iraq and Syria in the past?
True. And John, you mentioned that ballistic missile attack last week, that historic ballistic, in all the wrong ways, historic, the largest ballistic missile attack in military history that Iran conducted. What would the timetable be? We have about a minute left until the break, then you'll be right back with us. What would the timetable be for this potential Israeli strike?
We don't know exactly. I thought maybe October 7th was going to be the date. Then I thought maybe October 8th, because it was the day after October 7th. You go from mourning to celebration, which the Israelis do with their Remembrance Day and Independence Day. I think now it's probably going to have to happen after Yom Kippur. I think the government's going to want to give the people a breather.
And that's this Saturday.
That's this Saturday. So maybe we see it as soon as Sunday. But I think right now what we're watching is Biden and Netanyahu are having this conversation about deconfliction, about selecting targets. So it may be another couple days. I'll just say this. The Israelis have to be very careful how they do this. They can't miss. They can't get it wrong. They got to do it right the first time. It's the first green light they've had to attack the regime for 30 years.
Wow. John, well said. Great analysis, folks. He is the best in the business, and he'll be right back with us after the break. Don't move. Welcome back to Stack Back Tonight. We're talking to Jonathan Schanzer, Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. John, a lot of people may be wondering if Iran is a threat not only to Israel but also to the United States. Why is the Biden-Harris administration working so hard to restrain Israel from striking Iran in a major way?
Well, I think it's a matter of timing right now, and then it remains to be seen after that, right? We got an election coming up in about a month, and you got an administration that does not want the world on fire heading into the polls. Yeah. So what they're trying to do is they're constraining the Israelis, right? You don't really actually see them threatening the Iranians and telling them to stand down.
At all.
And this is a signature that we saw of the Obama years and also the Biden years, where you hold back your friends and maybe you just, admonish your enemies, your adversaries just a little bit. But the pressure we're seeing is on the Israelis. But that may change after early November. You may see the administration say, okay, you got a couple of months, go do your thing. But that all remains to be seen. It's going to be a question of where the military stands on this, what the base of the Democratic Party might be if Kamala Harris wins. If Trump is elected, well, that may give the Israelis a little bit more room to run. Yeah. I'm sure that's the calculus in Israel right now. But I think it's probably the difference of maybe a 3-month war versus a 6-month war. Either way, I got to say, there's a lot of danger here for everybody, for the United States, for our troops in the region, for the Israelis, of course. There's a lot of unknowns. Wars are not linear, right? You never know what happens once a new phase of this war breaks out.
Very true. What a time for this to happen, Jonathan. As you said, in October, in the run-up to the U.S. election, a wild, wild time in the Middle East, needless to say. Speaking of restraint, that seems to be a theme for the Biden administration with Israel. John, I think of the reluctance on the administration's part for Israel to go into Rafah, finish the job there with Hamas, and then in Lebanon to conduct a ground invasion against Hezbollah. Thankfully, Israel considered that, but then ultimately ignored the administration's wishes and went ahead. But why the constant attempts at restraining Israel?
I can't tell you that, but I can tell you it even goes before Rafah. I mean, the first thing that happened was after 10/7, the Israelis said, you know what? We know that Hamas attacked us, but we want to go north. We want to attack Hezbollah. We've got better attack plans, and they're the more dangerous threat. Yeah. Biden said, don't start wars you can't finish, and the Israelis were forced to go south. Then they go south, and they rip through northern Gaza. They get close to Rafah. The administration says, no, you can't fight during Ramadan. So the Israelis stop for an entire month, and they wait, and Hamas gets to rebuild and reorganize and get ready to fight again. The Israelis get ready to go into Rafah again. That's when the administration says, wait a minute, there could be war crimes if this happens, right? It didn't even happen. Nothing happened. And the Israelis were told that they had to hold off for months. Yeah. Then they finally go into Rafah. The president's furious. But as we can now see, that's when the tide of the war turned. By August, Hamas was a spent force.
And there were hostages in Rafah.
Correct. Yeah, that's 100% correct. And so the Israelis were actually able to save some of them. Yeah. Then they finally go north, and the administration is furious about the beeper operation. They're furious about the assassination of Nasrallah. But if you think about it now, what the Israelis did is they have eviscerated a terrorist group that has the blood of Americans on their hands, and yet we see the calls for restraint continue. Now, as we understand it, the president and the prime minister of Israel have finally talked after weeks of silent treatment, which really, that doesn't make any sense when you think about the Israelis fighting a war on 7 fronts. Yeah. I like to call it Israel's second war of independence. This is a war for their survival. The president's not speaking to the head of state of Israel. It is truly bizarre, and now we're seeing that they're also calling for restraint in terms of those oil targets and the nuclear sites. It just seems like the Israelis, it's already an uphill battle in terms of the media, the international community, the lawfare, all the things that they're dealing with, not to mention getting attacked on multiple fronts. And the administration is just holding them back step after step along the way.
Israel's fighting with one arm tied behind its back, essentially. Jonathan, last question, about 45 seconds left, and you'll be back soon. But Lebanon, that ground invasion, you mentioned finishing the job in Lebanon. How is that progressing? Israel obviously has decimated Hezbollah over the past 3 weeks or so. Ground invasion making pretty good headway?
It is. I mean, look, first you got to understand Israel's taken out 75% of the top leaders. I think there's about 2 guys left that I recognize in that leadership chart, which is impressive. You have a lot of the long-range weapons have been destroyed. Short-range weapons are still there, and that's why Israel's gone into southern Lebanon. They're going house to house. They're trying to collect those Katyushas and those shorter range rockets and the RPGs and all that kind of stuff. They're getting their way through, but it's going to be a tough slog. And you're going to see fallen soldiers. You're going to see injuries. You're going to see the North get pummeled in Israel. And so I don't think it ends anytime soon, but I do see that Hezbollah is in deep trouble. And there's even talk right now about some kind of unilateral ceasefire being declared by Hezbollah. We'll have to wait and see.
Amazing how Hezbollah now is pretty much begging for a ceasefire because they've been thumped, as you laid out. Jonathan, great job as always.